34. The Vipassana Jhanas. The Vipassana Jhanas are a way of describing the stages of insight that is a bit broader than the map that breaks the stages down into 16 jhanas. They are two descriptions of the same territory, and both have their uses. The Vipassana Jhanas differ from the Shamatha Jhanas in that they include the perception of the three characteristics, rather than the pure Shamatha Jhanas, which require ignoring the three characteristics to get the meditation object to appear stably and vividly. However, the two may share qualities, including very similar breadths of attention and other aspects. There are 7 Vipassana Jhanas, the first 4 that are formed, and the last 3 that are formless. The reason there are not 8 is that the 8th Vipassana Jhana, neither perception nor non-perception, cannot be easily investigated, as it is generally too subtle to clearly reveal the 3 characteristics. Thus, calling it a Vipassana Jhana is a bit problematic. However, it is part of the standard pattern of progress, so is worth remembering, and helps explain some of the material found in the old texts. Further, we can rapidly oscillate between the 7th and 8th jhanas in a way that is oddly Vipassana-esque, and this is common enough in strong practitioners, though being a very subtle business, many may not notice they are doing this unless directed to really look for it, or unless they have exceptional analytical skills. Concentration skills and analytical skills, while sometimes related, are not the same thing. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the original Pali texts use the same 4 or 8 jhanas to delineate the concentration states and the insight stages? Remember how I said that the delineation of the stages of insight didn't occur historically until a bit later, starting with the Abhidhamma, which was probably compiled about 1 to 2 centuries after the Buddha's death, and then expanded in the commentaries? In the second half of the 20th century, considerable deep practical experimental work was done to try to resolve these maps. As with most terminological issues in the spiritual life, there is significant disagreement about just how the jhanas and the stages of insight line up. I will touch on these in this chapter. The practical application of delineating the Vipassana jhanas is that the traps that awaited us in the Shamatha jhanas can arise during the progress of insight, so being able to apply the body of advice that addresses these occurrences can be very helpful. For instance, we may be going along in the progress of insight, but get stuck when we stop investigating rapture, which is part of the early jhanas and of some of the early insight stages. Thus, realizing that there are some relationships between the Shamatha and Vipassana jhanas can keep us on the lookout for aspects of our experience that we may be missing or artificially solidifying, this latter being so tempting to do, particularly with pleasurable meditative states. If we have some mastery of a set of insight stages, we can use these stages to learn to get into Shamatha jhanas by concentrating on solidifying their predominant positive qualities, what I call horizontal work. Since you can learn to stay in the same basic general jhanic level and shift from a more vibratory take on it to a smoother take. There are those who say that the jhanas and stages of insight do not line up at all, but this is too rigidly theoretical, often not in accord with direct experience on the cushion or in some other posture, and doesn't help resolve the problem apparent in the original texts of the Pali Canon. For those who are still die-hard traditionalists and believe that the jhana terminology only applies to pure concentration practices, I offer the following quote from the Buddha that is found in one of my favorite suttas, number 111, one by one as they occurred, in the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, as translated by Bhikkhu Nyanamoli and Bhikkhu Bodhi. And the states in the first jhana, the applied thought, the sustained thought, the rapture, the pleasure, and the unification of mind, the contact, feeling, perception, volition, and mind, the zeal, decision, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, and attention, these states were defined by him one by one as they occurred. Known to him they arose. Known to him they were present. Known to him they disappeared. He understood thus. So indeed, these states not having been, come into being. Having been, they vanish. Those with fixed views can squirm and pontificate any way they like. But this guy is clearly maintaining an extremely fast, consistent, and precise investigation of impermanence, and is thus clearly doing insight practices. I am aware of the argument that this text, while in the Pali Canon, might not be as old as some of the other texts in the Pali Canon, but I couldn't give a rat's ass. As it works, points to awesome practice, and by following this type of practice well, amazing insights reproducibly arise. Again, I am a pragmatist, and I will take my efficacious dharma where I can get it, and that sutta is one of the very best when it comes to teachings you can apply that work. To digress for just a moment, the guy the Buddha is talking about here is none other than my hero, Sariputta. The Buddha says that Sariputta goes on to do very precise and powerful insight practices high up into the formless realms and attains to very liberating insights. I often hear nouveau Tibetan Buddhists, often egged on by some of what is found in various non-Theravada texts, making comments that clearly indicate that they feel themselves to be qualified to denigrate his practice, and don't seem to notice how ironic this is, as they are almost always those whose own spiritual progress doesn't qualify them to lick the muddy sandals of someone with a fraction of Sariputta's realizations. When even 1 in 1,000 of the meditators I meet who make these absurd and insulting statements about Sariputta can do what he could do or understand what he understood, I'll eat this book. Back to business. All of this map stuff is only helpful if it keeps you practicing clearly and in a way that brings results. I will discuss more of the pros and cons of the maps soon enough.